Hi, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm shooting this video to discuss a community psychology point of view of looking at social structure, on a generation-old vision of social structure by Bernice Pescosolido and Beth Rubin, and a more contemporary vision of multiple social structures as described by Mark Smith and co-authors. So let's start with a community psychology model, which has been articulated for over a generation by Urie Bronfenbrenner. And Bronfenbrenner describes a series of systems in which individuals are embedded. Now notice this is a psychology model, so the outcome that is really of interest to Bronfenbrenner is individual life course outcomes, development, and being able to measure things about the individual. But Bronfenbrenner does say that individuals exist within micro, meso, exo, and chronosystems. So very briefly, because a colleague of mine, Katie Corlew, has already described this in a companion video that I encourage you to look up. A microsystem involves a person and their interactions with other people within contexts. Perhaps these are school friends, perhaps these are family members, perhaps these are co-workers. Then there are mesosystems, which move up from the microsystems and include connections between those groups within which the individual is involved, but that are connections that may not be limited to the person themselves. Notice it's still centered on this individual person. And then we have exosystems, which involve the connection between these groups within which the individual is embedded and some other groups that this individual is not embedded in, perhaps a sports team, perhaps, I don't know, a town next door, perhaps a competitor work environment. And finally, chronosystems describe the way in which these change over time. So, in the American Sociological Review, Bernice Pescosolido and Beth Rubin in the year 2000 come up with something significantly different, something that depends on Georg Simmel's articulation of sociology around the turn of the 20th century, 100 years before, in which the individual is not necessarily the central outcome to study, but the social system is the thing that we want to study, and in fact, in which the individual may just be an after effect of patterns of organization. Now, Simmel originally said, hey, we've had a change from a pre-modern era to a modern era. And in the pre-modern era, you might have had concentric circles. What does that mean? You have the immediate tightest connections and then increasingly loose connections, but all of which are embedded within one another. So you might have the most central circle containing an individual, a social environment being a family. And then there might be a neighborhood, but all of the families in the neighborhood. And then you have perhaps a church, but everyone in the neighborhood all goes to the same church. And then you might have a town to which people belong, but you'll notice that the church has everyone in the same town, and then there might be a nation, and everyone in the town is in that nation. What this means, according to Simmel, is that you have a highly uniform experience of everyone in that same family, because they're not only in the same family, they're in the same neighborhood, the same church, the same town, they're in the same nation. And so individuality, the very notion of individuality that comes in this conception from the way that groups overlap, individuality is de-accentuated. It doesn't appear as much as an idea until the modern era, because there are many individuals who have the same roles. Everyone in this family may be working on the farm together. They may not have differentiated roles. There is no differentiation in terms of town or nation or religion or neighborhood allegiance. So, for Zimmel, the transition to the modern period comes when people start moving within families. So people no longer within the same family live in the same town. People change their religions, their politics, they change their group membership. And when they do that, people within that family environment often become different from one another. In other words, they become individuated. The creation of the individual is, in this sense, a modern concept, the thing that is different from all others. And the reason that the individual is different from all others is that that individual is a unique combination of group memberships, and the group memberships create different individuals. We notice the difference, and in the modern period, we begin to think about individuals more. We create the idea of an individual with individual liberties and with individual rights, right? And we don't think about that before the Enlightenment, which is what we call it in the modern era, because it's the era that we've been living in. We don't think about it until then because individuals don't necessarily exist as this social creation. Think about that for a bit. And in the prior era, we instead think of primarily groups that you belong to and that you owe loyalty to. And the purpose of your life is to pursue that common identity, not your individual identity, not your individual fashion, right? So Pescosolido and Rubin then move on and they say, well, after considering postmodernism, this idea that we've moved beyond the modern era and can no longer rely on those standards, that there is something called a spoke structure in which individuals to some extent move, perhaps as Bronfenbrenner might describe in chronosystems, they move away, away from groups, hopping from one to the other now, so that they don't have a lifelong affiliation with any group, which means that the individual in that sense is somewhat outside a group and is a moving collection and recollection and reconnection and disconnection to a number of different groups, so that what an individual is, how an individual identifies, changes across the life course with changing group memberships. One of the things that Pescosolido and Rubin do, and that Zimmel do, is to think about in three different ages, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, emblematic ways of organizing the self with groups that characterize a whole age and a form of civilization, right? But I'd like to move on to a more recent way of thinking about the structure of relationships between groups and individuals that's been articulated by Mark Smith, Lee Rainey, Ben Schneiderman, and Ite Himmelboim. These scholars are involved in studying this new form of social media, which is online, and that makes it interesting. But another interesting thing about online interaction is that you can track it and you can measure it. And you can see it happen in real time in large scales. And what Smith and his colleagues have done is to look at actual different forms that occur within the same age. We're in the social media age, the internet age, and to say, no, actually, there's no one form that characterizes all group structures. There are multiple forms, and they identify 6. The first is the polarized crowd, where there are 2 groups within which there's a lot of interaction and little connection between the groups. Now, these pictures are pictures of interaction over Twitter, a platform on social media, and all those little squares are individual accounts, and those lines indicate a communication that occurs between accounts. So you'll notice here, yes, the image on the left is liberals, and yes, on the right, the image refers to conservative accounts. They're all speaking to one another a lot, and they very rarely refer to or communicate with one another. Polarized crowd, 2 groups, little connection between them. Another form is the tight crowd, where there are some subgroups, but boy, look at that. If you compare that to the polarized crowd, where there are these little gossamer threads between the groups, here there are these massive tight cables, right? If this was a muscled back, it would really need some massaging to work those tight strings out. This is a lot of connection between all the groups, and there is some differentiation. Okay, and Smith and colleagues take a look at some of the different hashtags that are used in the different groups, and they also characterize the groups as being groups to the extent that they're all tightly connected with one another, densely connected with one another, but they are also, between the groups, a lot of connection going on. Brand clusters are different. Boy, if this is like a massively fertile conversation here, this is the desert. And why is that? Because there are a lot of individuals on their own, separated, maybe having discussion in a few small groups, but mostly just talking and not relating to others. And in this case, this is Apple. This is how people talk about their iPhones. And when they do that, they're on their own. They're just saying. They aren't talking to anyone else. And that is a social structure too. On the other hand, you might have a community cluster, in which, yes, there are some individuals who are alone, but there are also a large number of small groups, some of whom are somewhat connected to each other, but this isn't like the polarized group in that there are just 2 clusters that are very separated. Well, there are many different ways of coming together here. And when they do come together, it's in small groups. On the other hand, sometimes in groups, there's one individual unit that is really important, one player, and that is the broadcaster here. In a broadcast network, and these are journalistic networks, there are reporters in the middle who say things, and there are individuals on the outside who listen. So it's all going out from the center, and individuals are on the outside listening. The final structure is a reverse of that, which is a support network, where there's an individual in the middle who's listening. In this case, this is customer service relationship. So there are a lot of users out there who are tweeting to customer service agents who are then listening and communicating back. So it's a 2-way conversation, not a 1-way broadcast, but there are individual central accounts and also very peripheral accounts that are on the outside that are not talking to one another, only talking to that central agent. So unlike Bronfenbrenner's model, and unlike Pesco-Solito's model, the Smith model is interesting because it suggests that at any one time, any one place, there are actually many different kinds of structures of communication between groups that create a different idea of what it is to be an individual. So the idea of what an individual is for, what an individual does, and what a group is for, and what a group does, differs for each of these. In a support network, your job as an individual is to communicate with the center, and the job of the center is to talk back, and if they don't talk back, people get upset. With the broadcast, there's one speaker and many listeners. Community clusters, you're trying to find your own small group of individuals who are not necessarily defining themselves as either or dichotomous, but who have something to say to each other. This is a more informal discussion. Brand clusters, you're just saying you're an atomized individual with a relationship actually to a product, to a gizmo, to a gadget, and not to another human being largely. Tight crowd, you have subgroups, but they're working together. Coordination. And polarized crowd. Oh, this is where war comes from. And so those kinds of structures can happen at one moment in one time. We can move from one to the other depending on the kind of conversation that we're having, rather than imagining that everyone at any moment, whether it's the postmodern moment, the modern moment, or the pre-modern moment, is living one kind of life and only one kind of life. As you think about what you want to do as an individual and a member of a group who is also part of a community and that is trying to serve a community, think about what role you imagine yourself playing as an individual and how you think the groups and communities around you are organized. There are a lot of models to choose from, and each of them suggests a different role for those groups, a different way of connecting between those groups, and a different role for you to play as an individual.